What if everything you're chasing right now is the very reason for your unhappiness? Think about it with me. The craving hits you out of nowhere. The silent envy in front of the feed. The weight of a life that feels too small. The sensation of missing out on something important happening somewhere else. And you, like any well-conditioned modern person, look for relief in the most obvious way, by buying whatever seems to be missing. But the hunger lives inside you. For a brief moment, you feel relief, and then reality comes knocking. Just as Epicurus described 23 centuries ago, the cycle of endless desires catches up with you again. A coldness in your chest. Nothing has changed, except that your bank account is lighter, and the next craving is already calling your name. Look, never in all of history has humanity had so much access to so many things. In a device that fits in the palm of your hand, there's more entertainment than a Roman emperor would have had in an entire lifetime. Food arrives at your door fast, new clothes show up in just a few days, movies and music multiply endlessly, and yet sleep has become a luxury. And still, the waiting lists for therapists only keep growing in major American cities. And still, the number of people who describe themselves as lonely, even when surrounded by others, keeps climbing in social surveys. The more you accumulate, the more you feel like something's missing. Something in this equation just doesn't add up. Maybe you feel this and can't quite put a name to it. That sense that there's always something important happening somewhere else, and you're missing out. That impression that your life, compared to other people's lives, is always one step behind. That emotional exhaustion that shows up right when everything, on paper, is going well. You're not crazy. It's the predictable effect of living inside a structure designed so that you never actually arrive. The first reaction in the face of this discomfort is always the same. Produce more, earn more, buy more, optimize more. If what you have isn't enough, maybe the next car will be enough, the next apartment, the next job title. But the next thing never comes. And when it does, there's already another next thing, shinier, more expensive, more desirable. It's a treadmill that moves a little faster every year, and you run on it thinking you're going somewhere. When in reality, you're just sweating to stay in place, at the exact same spot you've always been, with the only difference being that now you feel more tired. This is the point where philosophy stops being the subject of some dusty old book and starts looking like an emergency exit. Because someone, long before cars, screens, and credit cards, recognized the exact design of this trap. That someone was named Epicurus, and he lived between 341 and 270 before Christ. He was born on the Greek island of Samos, the son of Athenian colonists. He moved to Athens, and around 306 before Christ, he founded a philosophical school that became known as the Kepos, the Garden. It wasn't an austere academy, nor a marble temple. It was literally a garden, on the outskirts of Athens, where students gathered to discuss humanity's oldest and most ignored problem: how to reduce suffering. The era he lived in wasn't peaceful. Athens had lost its political autonomy after the death of Alexander the Great. Ordinary people, with no control over the larger course of the world, turned to a more intimate problem. No longer how to govern the ideal city, but how to live well inside a city you can't govern. Facing a world you can't change, how do you build peace within yourself? That's the question that drove Epicurus to found his school. And it's the same question that perhaps brought you to this video. Most of Epicurus's work was lost in the centuries that followed. It's estimated he wrote hundreds of books, almost all of it vanished. But some texts survived. The letter to Minucius, addressed to a young disciple, is perhaps the most important. There's also a long didactic poem in Latin called De Rerum Natura, written by the Roman poet Lucretius around 55 before Christ, which preserves and expands on Epicurean ideas. That poem, lost for centuries during the Middle Ages, was rediscovered in a German monastery at the beginning of the 15th century. And when it began circulating again, it shook up the way the European world thought about happiness, about desire, about how to live well. What Epicurus thought about in a garden in Athens continues to quietly shape the way the modern world tries to think about itself. Before moving on, we need to clear up a misunderstanding that has carried on through the centuries. The word Epicurean, in common usage, has become a synonym for someone given over to luxury, to excess, to fine dining, to sensual pleasure. Epicurus is painted as a defender of philosophical gluttony, of life disguised as an eternal party. This is, perhaps, the biggest misunderstanding in Western philosophy. Epicurus preached the opposite. He ate bread and cheese, he drank water, with wine only on rare occasions. In a letter to a friend, he wrote that he felt richer with a small jar of cheese than if he had banquets every day. To him, pleasure wasn't the unrestrained indulgence of the senses. It was something much more sober, aponia, which is the absence of pain in the body, and ataraxia, which is the deep calm of the mind. This is where everything starts to flip on its head. The misunderstanding didn't come about by chance. It was fueled by philosophical enemies of the time, and later by moralists who, throughout centuries of censorship, distorted what Epicurus actually said. The word Epicurean by the Middle Ages was basically an insult. And the worst part is that this caricature covered up the substance. Anyone who doesn't read the text imagines a banquet. Anyone who reads the text finds bread. Anyone who doesn't read imagines a party. Anyone who reads finds silence. History, in cases like this, isn't fair to the philosophers who speak softly. It favors those who shout. Epicurus never shouted. With that confusion cleared up, here comes the central gear of his thinking. In the letter to Meneceus, Epicurus divides all human desires into three types. The first group is the natural and necessary desires: eating when hungry, drinking when thirsty, taking shelter from the cold, sleeping, having true friends. These are desires with a clear limit. A glass of water quenches thirst. A simple meal is enough for hunger. A good friendship doesn't ask for much more than time and presence. And even the cold can be solved with an old blanket and a roof. When you meet these desires, they cease. The body settles, the mind rests. That's the hallmark of a natural and necessary desire. It has an end. The second group is the natural but unnecessary desires. Sophisticated food when simple food would have been enough. Rare wine when any drink would have quenched the thirst. A luxurious house when a sufficient house would already shield you from the cold. Designer clothes when any other piece would do the job. These desires aren't, in themselves, wrong, but they demand more energy, more money, more time, more attention invested in keeping up the standard, and they rarely deliver in peace what they promised in pleasure. The third group is the most dangerous: the empty desires, those that have no root in human nature but in vanity. Unlimited wealth, fame, power, social status, the approval of others. These desires have no end, because they don't originate from a real need of the body. They're phantoms that create hunger where there was no hunger. There's no point at which you say, "This is good, I'll stop here." There's always more. Look at how this plays out in everyday life. Someone buys an $80,000 car to feel like they've made it in life. For a few weeks, they feel it. Then, the car becomes part of the scenery. The brain gets used to it, and it starts noticing other, more expensive cars on the streets. The neighbor shows up with something a little better. The co-worker talks about a higher-end model. The sense of victory, which seems so solid, dissolves. The car is still the same. What changed was the expectation. This same pattern repeats on a larger scale, with houses, with offices, with vacations, with anything that can be shown off as a personal achievement. A roof doesn't matter on its own. What matters is the roof compared to other people's roofs. And since there will always be someone with a higher roof, the feeling of inadequacy never ends. That's the natural state of anyone living inside empty desires, almost arriving without ever arriving. Empty desires are, by definition, insatiable. Whoever wants to be recognized will never have enough recognition. There will always be someone with more followers, more applause, more influence, more space on the stage. Whoever wants to be rich will never be rich enough, because the bar keeps moving. There's a concept in economics known as the Easterlin paradox, first described in 1974, which describes something unsettling. Beyond a certain income threshold, more money doesn't bring more happiness. societies get richer, and the average level of satisfaction stays pretty much the same. All you earn is the right to compete on another board with heavier pieces. I know it's hard to hear this, but modern man, to a large extent, works for decades to buy what he doesn't need, in order to impress people he doesn't even know. And that sentence, as simple as it sounds, describes with almost clinical precision the cycle we live in. But what few people realize is that there's a second layer to this, and it's even more uncomfortable, because the structure of this cycle is wired into the very way our brain works, and that's exactly what we're going to look at now. To unlock this mechanism, Epicurus proposes a distinction that may well be the silent heart of his philosophy: the difference between pleasure in motion and stable pleasure. Pleasure in motion is the pleasure of something new arriving. It's the rush of the first sip, the first bite, the first message that pops up on the screen. It's intense, it's brief, and it always demands another dose. Stable pleasure, on the other hand, is the serenity after the meal. It's the silence after a good conversation. It's that rare, almost invisible feeling of, now everything is fine, I don't need anything else. The first is what the structural logic of the marketplace sells non-stop, because it depends on the next purchase to keep turning. The second is what that same machine can't sell, because once you've reached it, it's enough. And that may be the simplest explanation for that emptiness that comes right after delivery. The package arrived, you opened it. You felt 3 seconds of pleasure in motion, and then the brain asked, now what? Modern science, without meaning to, has proven Epicurus right. Research on how the brain works has shown that the substance linked to dopamine, which many people associate with pleasure, is actually more tied to the anticipation of pleasure than to pleasure itself. It fires off before the reward, not during it. That's why the act of wanting is more intense than the act of having. That's why desire in itself is more active than satisfaction. The human brain was designed, in its deepest architecture, to chase, not to rest. And whoever understands this, understands why the rich keep accumulating, why the famous keep seeking more stage time, why successful people keep being unhappy. The internal system is calibrated for the chase, and the chase, by definition, never ends, except through a conscious act that says, this is enough, I'm stopping here. Learning to feel the difference between these two kinds of pleasure is the first big step toward inner liberation. When you start to realize that true happiness doesn't come from constant motion, but from the ability to stay still in peace, something shifts on the inside. You start to look with more irony at the ads that promise intensity. You start to notice how much of your life was spent chasing experiences that promised to leave a permanent mark on you, and that, the next day, had already evaporated. You start to understand why those simple afternoons, with almost nothing happening, are remembered with more affection than wildly expensive vacations. There's something in them that unrestrained indulgence can't copy. And when you discover what it is, life slowly begins to rearrange itself around it. This serenity has a name in Greek. Epicurus called it Ataraxia, which is, in simple translation, the deep calm of the mind. It's the state in which the mind stops being dragged from one anxious thought to another. It's not apathy, nor coldness, nor disengagement, nor indifference to life. It's the clarity of someone who is no longer being pulled by the invisible currents of empty desire. To Epicurus, this was the highest state a human being could reach. And the most subversive detail is this: Ataraxia is free. No anxious billionaire, sleeping on pills in a beachfront mansion on Long Island, is freer than an ordinary man who, at the end of a simple day, sits in a chair on the porch, listens to the wind, and feels that he is okay. No figure in a bank account can buy that state. It's cultivated, with time, with silence, with few desires, and with plenty of patience. And whoever has experienced it, even just a glimpse, knows that it has no price tag, because it's the first time, in a long time, that the internal noise has gone quiet. Alongside ataraxia stands aponia, the absence of pain in the body. And here, Epicurus noticed something simple and devastating. To anyone who is truly hungry, any bread is divine. To anyone who is truly thirsty, water is the most sublime liquid in the world. To anyone who is genuinely cold, an old blanket becomes the greatest comfort imaginable. Luxury, he said in essence, doesn't increase pleasure. It only numbs the perception of what is enough. The body that eats banquets every day stops tasting bread. The body that sleeps on expensive mattresses stops feeling the comfort of simply lying down. The repetition of luxury creates numbness, and numbness demands ever greater luxuries to feel anything at all. Whoever relearns how to feel the enough discovers that it was always closer than it seemed. And they also discover that rediscovering real hunger, real thirst, real exhaustion is a strange kind of inverted luxury, because it gives back the capacity to feel. Notice this. Think, for example, of someone who has spent the whole day hiking outdoors, maybe on a trail in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. At the end of the day, starving, they show up at a simple inn and eat a bowl of hot soup with bread. That dish, in that moment, is capable of producing more real pleasure than a $600 dinner at the best restaurant in Manhattan, eaten by someone who isn't hungry, who isn't tired, who only ordered out of habit. The luxury isn't in the food, it's in the hunger. The luxury isn't in the object, it's in the prior absence. And that's exactly what modern life, in its obsession with eliminating every discomfort, slowly kills. Anyone who is never hungry has lost bread. Anyone who is never thirsty has lost water. Anyone who is never tired has lost rest. Anyone who never has silence has lost music. The Kipos, the garden, was Epicurus's practical attempt to live all of this. In a Greece that valued political ostentation, courtroom oratory, and battlefield glory, he withdrew to the outskirts of Athens and founded a community devoted to simple living and philosophical friendship. The diet was bread, cheese, olives, and water as the main drink, with wine only on rare occasions. They talked, they thought, they wrote, and sometimes they sat in silence together. And here's a detail that scandalized classical Greece. The garden welcomed women, welcomed foreigners, even welcomed enslaved people as students. In a rigidly hierarchical society, this was almost a silent manifesto. Happiness, to Epicurus, was not a privilege of class or of gender. It was accessible to anyone who accepted the program of reducing empty desires, cultivating true friendships, practicing philosophy as a daily exercise, and learning to feel what is enough. The garden was living proof that one could be deeply happy with very little, as long as you had the right things. And the right things, to Epicurus, were almost always people, not objects. And this is exactly where the part that nobody tells you comes in. This may be the most beautiful and most ignored idea of Epicurus. In Principle Doctrine 27, he states that of all the things wisdom offers us for the happiness of an entire life, friendship is, by far, the greatest good, not fame, not wealth. Friendship. And it's hard to think of a more radical statement for today's world. We live in the age of shallow connections. Thousands of friends in networks who barely know our last name. Messages exchanged with emojis to wrap up conversations. Meetups put off for months on end because the schedule is full. And at the same time, modern research shows that being chronically lonely raises the risk of serious physical problems to levels comparable to harmful addictions. Loneliness isn't just sadness, it's damage to your physical health. Epicurus intuited this, without data, 23 centuries ago. He knew that human beings need a few real people the way they need bread and water. Reducing material pleasures and deepening friendships is a trade where you always come out ahead. It may be uncomfortable to admit, but it's not an easy trade. Real friendships demand time, presence, patience, and even discomfort. They demand showing up even when you don't feel like it. They demand listening even when you want to talk. They demand, ultimately, giving up part of your own distraction to be fully present for another person. And maybe that's why so many adult friendships, even old ones, quietly fade away. There's no fight. There's no formal ending. Only at some point, there stops being time. The afternoons that used to be spent talking turned into afternoons spent scrolling feeds. Phone calls were replaced by texts by emoji reactions, and then by nothing. The person disappears and nobody notices when they vanished. Recovering a friendship in that state requires moving against the current, scheduling coffee weeks in advance, showing up even when you don't feel like it, listening without checking your phone, going back to asking what matters. In an age of acceleration, that's almost a revolutionary gesture. For Epicurus, philosophy wasn't an academic exercise. It wasn't a display of intelligence. It wasn't sophisticated debate meant to impress audiences in Athens. It was medicine. In a sentence preserved in the Epicurean texts, he states that empty is the word of the philosopher that does not cure any human suffering, just as empty is the medicine that does not drive away the diseases of the body. Philosophy that doesn't cure is wasted speech. And that image is perhaps the most powerful in all of his work. Thought as remedy, as care, as a daily practice for cleaning the soul of excess, of fear, and of empty desire. Without that inner practice, any outer simplicity becomes empty aesthetics. It becomes a pose. It becomes just another product to be consumed. The minimalist life has become a niche within market dynamics, with books, courses, apps, and influencers teaching you to buy fewer clothes, so you can then buy more courses about buying fewer clothes. Epicurus would catch the irony in seconds. Freedom, to him, begins in the mind, in the way we interpret what happens to us. Without working on the mind, simplifying the house is just changing the scenery of the prison. You can throw out half of your clothes, donate half of your furniture, move into a smaller apartment, and still be profoundly anxious. Because the real clutter was never in the closet, it was in your head. And it was for this inner clutter that Epicurus left behind, perhaps, his most useful synthesis. The so-called tetrapharmacon, or fourfold remedy, is a 4-line formula that sums up his entire philosophy. The 4 lines are these. First, do not fear the gods. Second, do not fear the end. Third, the good is easy to obtain. Fourth, the bad is easy to endure. Each of these phrases is a key that unlocks an inner door, and together they form a silent manual for liberation. Not fearing the gods, in the Epicurean context, means not living under the constant threat of cosmic surveillance, of arbitrary punishment, of an invisible judge ready to hand out penalties. Epicurus didn't deny the existence of the gods. He claimed that if they existed, they would live in perfect calm, in the spaces between worlds, with no interest in the petty details of human life. Today, even for those who don't think much about gods, this line can be read in another way. Not fearing the invisible judges you carry within, the internalized voices of parents, of bosses, of algorithms, of the people you follow online. The constant feeling that someone, somewhere, is ready to point the finger. Letting go of that weight is, in itself, one of the greatest possible liberations. Because a large part of contemporary unease doesn't come from real problems. It comes from the imaginary audience each of us carries inside our heads, judging life in real time. The second line, do not fear the end, is perhaps the hardest. In the letter to Minimalist, Epicurus writes a famous sentence, "The end is nothing to us, for while we exist, it is not present, and when it arrives, we are no longer there." It's a cold, almost mathematical line of reasoning, and that's precisely what makes it effective. It's not about denying the sadness of losing others. Epicurus wrote moving texts about the loss of friends. It's about not living your entire life held hostage by the fear of your own finitude. The modern obsession with extreme longevity, with anti-aging supplements, with increasingly aggressive cosmetic procedures, with building a legacy capable of outliving the body, comes in large part from this refusal to face finitude. There are, today, in Silicon Valley, executives investing millions in protocols to try to push back the end of life as far as possible. There are clinics selling seemingly miraculous solutions. There are apps that monitor every heartbeat, every hour of sleep, every calorie, in a silent attempt to push the inevitable further away. There's nothing wrong with taking care of your health. There's something deeply wrong with living dominated by that fear. Whoever accepts that this hour will come and really accepts it, not as a philosophical idea, but as a basic fact, gains the present back. because time stops being an infinite stockpile and becomes a precious resource, and you stop spending it on what doesn't matter. The third line, the good is easy to obtain, is maybe the most radical to today's ears. Epicurus claims that what is truly good for a human being is, most of the time, simple and accessible. Water, bread, sleep, sunshine, friendship, good conversation, a walk, some light through the window. When you reduce the empty desires, you realize that the good was always closer than it seemed. The complication isn't in the good itself, it's in the inflated expectation of what you believe it should be. Think of a morning with no commitments, with coffee brewed at home, the window open, a book in your hands, and no apps open. That's free, in economic terms. But that's exactly the kind of morning that has vanished from most people's lives, not because it was banned, because it was replaced by the constant feeling that there's always something better to do. Something more productive, something more special. And what was right there, within arm's reach, stops being seen as the good it always was. The fourth line, the bad is easy to endure, seems less obvious, but it has its own logic. For Epicurus, intense pain tends to be brief, and lasting pain tends to be bearable. The kind of extreme, prolonged suffering that would make life unbearable is, according to him, rarer than the imagination makes it seem. The mind suffers far more by anticipation than by present pain, and learning to separate real pain from imagined pain is once again a form of liberation. Modern studies show that human beings systematically overestimate the emotional impact of future negative events. We imagine that a layoff, a breakup, a failure will destroy us, and they almost never do. We adapt. We return to our baseline. Epicurus already knew this without needing studies. Of these four cures, perhaps the cure for the fear of finitude is the main doorway. Because behind almost every empty desire hides, deep down, this fear. The obsession with unlimited wealth is, to a large extent, an attempt to buy security. The obsession with fame is an attempt to keep on existing through the memory of others. The obsession with digital validation is an attempt to exist more than your own existence allows. Whoever faces finitude with serenity gains something that no billionaire can buy, the lightness of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. There's no more blind urgency, no more corrosive comparison. There is, instead, a calm attention to what matters, and a trained indifference to what doesn't. From there, another central idea in Epicurean philosophy opens up: self-sufficiency. In the Vatican sayings, we read that freedom is the greatest fruit of self-sufficiency. The sentence is short, but it's worth decades of reading. Self-sufficiency, in the Epicurean sense, doesn't mean isolation. It doesn't mean becoming a hermit, fleeing the world, refusing relationships. It means, above all, inner independence. Not needing excess to be okay. Not needing the next purchase to feel relief. Not needing the next like to feel valuable. Not needing the next compliment to feel worthy. The Epicurean self-sufficient man is not the man closed in on himself. He is the man who, because he is already whole, can approach others without urgency, without manipulation, without dependency. Whoever is self-sufficient cannot be manipulated, not by brands, not by opinions, not by trends, not by emotional blackmail. That is the purest form, and the most inconvenient one for the incentives of the productive system of practical freedom, because an entire society of self-sufficient people would be, for certain sectors, a full-blown commercial problem. And here comes one of the most provocative pieces of advice attributed to Epicurus: leithbioses, which in literal translation means live hidden. That advice today sounds almost scandalous. In an era where we're taught that everything has to become content, that every experience must be photographed, that every accomplishment must be announced or it didn't really happen, the idea of living hidden seems, at the very least, heretical. But it's not about cowardice. It's not about running away from the world. It's about refusing the permanent theatre of other people's approval. The man who lives hidden isn't running away. He simply stops performing for the audience. He eats without photographing. He travels without posting. He reads without quoting. He helps without announcing. He loves without showing it off. He discovers, in relative anonymity, a rare kind of peace. Because while life is being performed for a digital audience, it is, to some degree, being lived for others. And a life lived for others is never, in fact, your own. If you made it this far, it's because something inside you already knows this. Recent research points to a troubling correlation between heavy social media use and rising emotional exhaustion, especially among young people. The mechanism behind this is, to a large extent, the act of comparing your own life with other people's lives on the networks. When you scroll a feed, you rarely see the ordinary, everyday lives of those people. You see a highly edited selection of their lives. The vacations, not the exhausted Friday. The promotion, not the years of frustrating work. The smile, not the half-hour argument before the photo. Comparing your own daily life with that curated parade is, in practical terms, comparing your own backstage with other people's stage. The result is mathematical. You always come out feeling that your own life falls short. That's one of the silent gears of contemporary malaise. And Epicurus, without knowing what a social network was, left behind the key to unlock it. There can be no peace as long as the yardstick for personal worth is hanging on the opinion of a digital audience that changes its mood with every algorithm. Peace begins when that yardstick is brought back inside and calibrated by criteria that belong to the one living the life, not to the ones watching it. The Epicurean reading of contemporary consumption, even though he never lived to see malls, ads, and algorithms, is unsettlingly accurate. Advertising, within the structural logic of the market, does the exact opposite of philosophy. It sells empty desires disguised as natural needs. It turns thirst into thirst for a specific brand. It turns hunger into hunger for an expensive restaurant. It turns the need for shelter into a craving for prestigious addresses. It turns the natural search for belonging into a race for tribal status. The global advertising industry, within this market dynamic, moves more than $1 trillion a year. All of that money is spent ultimately on one single task: keeping you wanting. The result is a sentence, already foreshadowed, that sums up the lives of entire generations. People buy what they don't want, with money they don't have, to impress people who don't love them. Every impulse purchase, seen through that lens, is a new chain. Every conscious refusal, a broken link. At some point, it stops being just a matter of personal finance and becomes intimate politics. The person who learns to desire less becomes, silently, an anomaly within the economic machine. And that's exactly the kind of anomaly the world needs, in large numbers. Hold on, because what comes next changes everything. All of this, in philosophy, is beautiful. In practice, it's a bit rougher. Epicurus wasn't naive. He knew that theory only counts if it becomes a habit. That's why his philosophy translates into simple, repeated, almost invisible practices. Eating with real hunger, and not out of habit, out of boredom, or out of emotional compensation. Waiting until you actually feel hungry before putting food in your mouth, and noticing, surprised, how the simplest piece of bread becomes a feast when you come to it starving. Reducing needs before increasing income. Before chasing a raise, ask yourself where the feeling of being short really lives. Often, it doesn't live in the paycheck. It lives in the list of things you believe you need. Cultivating a few deep friendships instead of many shallow contacts. Accepting that your schedule can't fit 30 close people, and that 5, when well taken care of, are enough for an entire lifetime. Setting aside time for silence. Not mystical silence, not performed silence, just moments when your phone stays in another room and your head can listen to itself without noise. Practicing, every now and then, a voluntary abstinence, with short periods of eating only bread and water, precisely to relearn the value of what is enough, not as punishment, but as training. As a reminder that luxury, once it becomes the default, stops being felt as luxury. These practices are not deprivation, they're training for freedom. Simplicity isn't declared in a single day. It's built up in small, repeated habits with almost no ceremony. There are other practices worth naming. The first is the habit of reviewing, at the end of the day, the desires of the day. Which were natural and necessary? Which were natural but unnecessary? Which were empty? That exercise, done honestly, gradually reveals how big a slice of life is spent chasing after the third group. The second is what you could call the memory of the simple. Reminding yourself often of past moments when you were happy with very little. A childhood afternoon, a cheap trip, a lunch with a dear friend. Those moments, when remembered, show that true happiness was rarely associated with excess. It lived in the simple, and it still lives there, waiting. The third is the habit of concrete gratitude, which is not the generic, cliché kind of gratitude. It's specific gratitude for that particular breakfast, for that 5-minute conversation in the hallway, for that moment when your body, even tired, still works well enough to climb a flight of stairs without worry. These small mental notes reorganize, over time, the way the brain perceives life. Instead of scanning the horizon for the next big prize, it learns to see, all around, the small things that were always there. There's also a fourth practice, perhaps the most underrated of all: learning to stay still. It's not sleeping, it's not technical meditation, it's not doing anything productive, it's not even trying to reach some special state. It's just being still, sitting in a chair, looking out the window, without grabbing the phone to fill the void. For most people, this exercise is unbearable. The first few minutes bring on itching and restlessness, a diffuse uneasiness that makes the brain, addicted to stimulation, desperately look for something to do. Resisting that itch for a few minutes a day is a quiet form of training. Little by little, the initial boredom turns into something else. It turns into a kind of inner landscape. Thoughts pass through, but don't demand to be followed. Ideas arrive, but don't demand to be acted on. And in that brief, modest interval, something rare appears. The sense of being fully where you are, with no before, no after, no target. There's a point, after months or years moving in this direction, when something silent happens. The person notices that they have stopped wanting things that once seemed essential. They didn't reject them. They didn't crusade against them. They simply, at some point, stopped weighing on them. The ad goes by, and there's no itch. The co-worker shows off the new car, and there's no envy. The group talks about the expensive trip, and there's no feeling of inadequacy. The person realizes they are free not because they have more, but because they need less. And that may be the cleanest definition of freedom that philosophy has ever produced. The interesting detail is that this shift almost never arrives all at once. There's no single day when you wake up different. There are instead weeks when something passes by unnoticed. The shopping cart stays half empty. The urge to open the shopping app doesn't come up. The next trip stops being planned with the urgency of someone needing to escape and becomes something chosen calmly. Nobody celebrates, nobody applauds. In fact, the world around you tends to find it strange. People close to you ask if everything is okay, if there's been some financial trouble, if your appetite for life has gone down. Because society has trouble recognizing peace when it shows up without noise. Used to confusing agitation with vitality, it sees calm as a symptom of something wrong. And maybe it takes a certain quiet courage to keep walking this path, even in the face of that strangeness. Relationships change too. Some old friendships, based on sharing common complaints about how heavy life is, lose their fuel. When you stop complaining about your salary, your boss, the traffic, the last expensive thing you felt forced to buy, certain conversations simply come to an end. In exchange, other friendships, once silent, start showing up. People who had always been there, without making noise, now become central. Deeper conversations come up because there's time for them. And a certain quality of presence, which had seemed lost, returns without warning. It's not that you traded friends. It's that you shifted your center of gravity, and the right friends came along with you. Work also takes on another shape. It doesn't disappear, of course, no one lives on air. But it stops being the center of gravity of your identity. When you reduce what you need, you also reduce what you need to earn. And when you reduce what you need to earn, you get back something precious: the right to choose, to accept or refuse projects, to work with decent people instead of accepting bad situations just for a bigger paycheck, to leave a little earlier on days when the sun is good, to turn down the next promotion when it would cost too many hours. It's not a rebellion against work, it's a reorganization of the hierarchy. Work serves life, and not the other way around. For many people, this simple inversion takes decades to happen, and many reach the end without ever having made it. This state has a specific texture. It's not euphoria, it's not sadness. It's a kind of low-volume calm that settles in slowly, and that, by the time you notice it, is already there. Mornings stretch out longer, because there's no hurry to get anywhere. Dinners fill up more, because there's no phone on the table cutting the conversation. Sundays get wider, because there's no rush to produce something relevant before they end. Small things start to feel big again. A sunset you actually watch, and not through a screen. A handwritten letter to a friend. A meal cooked without rushing, with few ingredients, but with attention. Life stops being an obstacle course and becomes a space you live in. And that difference, though hard to describe, is everything. Anyone who has lived in a life like that, even for a few days, knows that going back to the race becomes harder, because the body remembers, and the body, once it has remembered peace, begins to refuse. In silence, whatever takes that peace away. There's an old word from Latin that captures this state well: quies. Medieval monks used it to talk about a kind of stillness that isn't just the absence of outer noise, but the presence of an inner stability. Contemplative practitioners, across various traditions, describe something similar by other names. Epicurus, centuries before any monastery, was already pointing in that direction when he spoke of Ataraxia. What all those names point to, at bottom, is the same basic experience. The human possibility, real and accessible, of being fully where you are, without needing anything more, without struggling against the present, without escaping into the next desire. That experience, though simple, is one of the rarest things in contemporary life. And paradoxically, it's also one of the oldest. It was always available. It was always waiting. We just, for some reason, stopped looking for it. Because freedom, in the end, is not having every option open. Having every option open is a sophisticated form of paralysis. Modern studies show, with consistent data, that an excess of options increases inner unease and reduces satisfaction. The more choices, the more regret. The more alternatives, the more the feeling that the one you chose might not have been the best one. True freedom is needing less. It's being able to look at a world full of promises and know calmly that none of it is necessary for the day to be good. It's being able to close the app, end the workday, sit down in a simple chair, listen to your breathing, and feel that enough has already arrived. Whoever reaches that feeling, even for moments, has silently won a game that most people keep playing without realizing they're playing. And the most beautiful thing is that this game, unlike almost every other, isn't won by accumulating. It's won by letting go. Maybe that's why, in the end, the philosophy of Epicurus sounds more like a whisper than a speech. He didn't ask for followers. He didn't build empires. He didn't compete for prestige in the courts of Athens. He built a garden, ate bread, talked with friends, and wrote letters to his disciples. At the end of his life, suffering from a very difficult physical illness, he wrote to his friend Idomeneus one of the most beautiful letters in the history of philosophy. He said, in essence, that on that day, despite the extreme pain, it was a happy day, because the memory of the philosophical conversations with his friends made up for any suffering of the body. That is perhaps the final test of what he taught. A sick man, in his final moments, able to say sincerely that the day was good. That man had understood something that 23 centuries of progress, comfort, and technology have still not managed to teach the average of humanity. Think about this for a moment. A man about to leave this world, in the midst of pain that few of us would have the courage to imagine, still able to sincerely say that day was good. not out of stoicism, not out of pretense, not out of some spiritualized resignation for show, but because, over the course of an entire life lived with care, he had built something inside himself that physical pain could not knock down. A deep calm, planted with bread, with cheese, with conversation, with philosophy, with friendship. That calm is perhaps the most precious legacy of Epicurus, and it is completely unattainable through money. You don't buy it. You don't download it in an app. You don't hire a specialist to deliver it to you. You cultivate it over the years with small, silent choices that no one applauds in the moment. And in the end, when the rest of the world is searching for relief in every corner, you discover that you have inside yourself a space where nothing of what is happening out there can fully get in. There's one more detail worth saying before the end. This philosophy doesn't promise paradise. It doesn't promise to eliminate all pain, all discomfort, all sadness. Epicurus was too much of a realist for that promise. He knew that the body gets sick, that loved ones leave, that the world, at times, is simply hard. What he offered was something else, a way of suffering less than necessary, a way of not adding to the real weight of life, the imaginary weight of empty desires, a way of holding, even in the middle of discomfort, a firm foundation of inner calm. That's not happiness in the sense sold by the ads. It's something more sober, more lasting, and harder to imitate. It's happiness as stability, happiness as sufficiency, happiness as the absence of the inner agitation that most people, without knowing it, mistake for life itself. The school he founded remained active for more than 500 years. It crossed empires and generations, took in people from everywhere, Romans and Greeks, free people and enslaved people, in a mix few schools of the time accepted. It was attacked by rival philosophers, then by moralists of every kind, and made it through the censorship of the centuries however it could, in fragments and in manuscripts forgotten in distant monasteries. And even when reduced to the bare minimum, it remained capable of touching whoever came across it in any era. Because what it says doesn't age. The empty desires of the 4th century before Christ are the same as those of the 21st century. The loneliness of the man who has too much is the same. The weight of the invisible judges is the same. The envy of the neighbor is the same. And the way out is the same too. Reduce desires, cultivate friendship, practice philosophy as a daily exercise, and learn to wait for hunger to feel the bread, for thirst to feel the water, for tiredness to feel the rest, for silence to feel the music. To exist instead of proving that you exist. The question that remains doesn't need to be answered right now. It needs to be carried. What are you still chasing that doesn't bring you peace? As long as pleasure is sought outside, you will be a prisoner of the world. When you learn to feel it within, no one will be able to take it away from you. Epicurus understood this 23 centuries ago, and he is still waiting, in silence, on the other side of each of his texts, for other people to understand it too. That question, if truly carried, will change you slowly. You'll start catching yourself in trivial situations asking, in silence, whether that is really necessary. You'll start noticing, in your chest, a subtle difference between the wanting that comes from the body and the wanting that comes from vanity. You'll start to realize, with some initial discomfort, how many of your rushes over the last few years were driven by a third kind of desire that wasn't even really yours. It belonged to the audience. It belonged to comparison. It belonged to the fear of falling behind in a race nobody ever really explained to you. And that realization, although uncomfortable, is the first step of liberation. Because nobody lets go of what they don't see. And once you start to see, the letting go begins to happen almost on its own, at your own pace, without ceremony, without fanfare. If this video made sense to you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey, and consider joining the Members Club, where we go deeper into philosophical practices like these week after week. The rest of the world keeps offering intensity. Here, we keep building, slowly, the one thing it doesn't sell: peace.